Chapter 10, Motivation. It's described as the willingness to put effort into learning. You might be wondering why there's a football TV and Rocky Balboa reading a book on the page. So, in the chapter, it's described as a student's willingness to put effort into learning, and there's many factors which range from the student's personality and his or her abilities to the characteristics of a particular learning task, incentive for learning, setting, and teacher behavior. So, some students might be motivated to play football. Some students might be motivated to sit at home and only watch TV. But anybody can be motivated to do well in school, and that's our job as teachers. That's why I put the picture of Rocky Balboa reading a book. If you know the story of Rocky Balboa, he started off and he didn't even know how to read, could barely talk right, but he was extremely motivated. He was only a fighter, but he was motivated to learn how to read, to better himself, and to better his life. So eventually he sat down and he learned how to read. So that's our job as a teacher, is to find what motivates the student rather than just yelling at the students to sit down and read. We can find alternate ways to make it even fun for the students, so then they actually enjoy learning. So later on, when they get to harder classes, they're able to keep up in those classes. Enforcers. Enforcers have to do with motivation and behavioral learning theory. An enforcer would help a behavior that you would want to see again. So a behavior that has been reinforced in the past is more likely to be repeated than a behavior that has not been reinforced. So in the chapter, the author uses money as an example. So there's a scenario where there's a guy doing like some kind of paint job or something like that, and the guy does a bad job, and he originally said he'll do it for $50, but when he was done, he said, I don't think you did that good of work, so instead of $50, here's $40. So same scenario, if the person would have offered him $50 to begin with, or if he would have known that this guy could have done a bad job, he could have said, I'll do $40, and when he was done, if you wanted him to do a better job, he could have tipped him $10 and said, here's $50, I think you did an excellent job. The guy is most likely going to do a better job. I personally think that this wasn't a good situation to use as an example. I think a better example would have been, for educational purposes, a student in a classroom, if they were to get a bad grade, rather than saying, if you don't get a good grade next time, you can say, if you get a good grade next time, you will be rewarded with 10 minutes of extra recess, 5 minutes of extra recess, a positive enforcer. Intrinsic motivation. As described in the chapter, enhancing intrinsic motivation starts by creating a supportive classroom environment. On the left, you have a beautiful classroom, lots of color. It's very promoting to students' learning. And on the right, you have a prison cell. I personally did have classes where I had teachers who seemed very motivated and excited to teach, and I also had teachers that it was obvious they got into the teaching profession just to become a football coach, or that was definitely not their first choice in life. The difference between the two teachers was very obvious when it came to the classrooms. On the left, beautiful classroom. On the right, cell block. In those classrooms where it was a cell block, a student's motivation to learn it was noticeable that a student was not motivated to learn. They were only interested in getting the grade and leading the class. On the other hand, in the other class that was bright and beautiful, students were encouraged. They decided to participate more. They usually got higher grades, and they were overall just more motivated. Our job as a teacher is extremely important because if a student feels as if the topic that's being presented is boring, they're most likely not going to be motivated to learn it. They're just going to be motivated to get it down for a little bit, get a good grade, and forget about it. So as a teacher, the best thing that we could do, as it describes in the chapter, is to arouse interest in the subject, teach the lesson, but also find a common ground for it to be interesting to the student, so then they're more likely to retain the information and they're internally motivated to learn it because they enjoy it, not just because they have to. Another method that was described in the chapter is maintaining curiosity, and it uses an example of a science teacher showing an experiment prior to teaching the lesson. So then the students are fired up about the lesson. They're excited to learn. They're curious as to why let's say they fill up a balloon with helium and the balloon floats. The students are curious to why that balloon floats. But if the teacher were to just say helium is lighter than regular air, students are most likely not going to be motivated to listen. Summary of Chapter 10, key topics. Motivation, internal and external. We as future teachers, it's very important we grasp the subject of whether or not a student needs to learn, if they need to be pushed, or if they need to be prompted questions in order to be curious to succeed in a class. That is our job in order to make those students successful. It's also important that we find proper enforcers. Finding out what a student needs in order to not only pass the class, but grasp the subject to where they can use it later on in life. If we only teach these upcoming students, the information to get a good grade on the test and then forget the information, we're failing them. We need to make sure they can actually grasp this information so then they can use it and build upon it. Finding those enforcers is going to help that because those students are most likely going to find whatever it is that they're motivated, and we're going to enforce it through whatever means necessary so then they can use that information and eventually graduate and get a great job.